We are so excited to have the Women in Preservation Symposium launched, and welcome to HerStory and Preservation panel discussion, celebrating the women of the past and recognizing their contributions to the present. It's opening day, and Women in Preservation, and we are the first virtual panel presentation of this great symposium. I have the pleasure to moderate this panel and share with you the opportunity to meet the panelists as professionals and people. It is our hope today that all of you will come to better understand and celebrate past women of preservation and to recognize women's contributions to the field to the present day. Each speaker will present for 10 to 12 minutes, followed by any final group questions, and then the Q&A from the audience, which I will moderate. So please sit back, listen, get your questions ready, and submit it in the Q&A function. Biographies of each of the speakers are available on the on the symposium website. So we will transition smoothly through our 4 talks with Anna Duff of the NSCDA up first, followed by Dr. Lydia Brandt of USC, Amy Williams of the Andrew Jackson Foundation, and finally, Elizabeth Kostelny of Preservation, Virginia. So let's get started. We have about 75 minutes to get through all of the presentations and the questions, and it is my pleasure to welcome Ms. Anna Duff, whose vision for the Women in Preservation Symposium is a real reason we are here today. Thank you, Anna, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to share with you a snapshot of the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America and its long-standing mission of preservation, and to recognize the collective efforts of thousands of our members who have shared their time, talent, and resources to preserve our history. The legacy of the NSCDA is vitally connected to the history of our nation, and we are committed to supporting historic preservation, history education, and patriotic service through patriotic philanthropy. As it remains today, the earliest versions of the NSCDA Constitution state, the objects of this society shall be to preserve and restore buildings connected with the early history of our country. We have embraced these words since the earliest days of the NSCDA. Now we will talk about our early preservation work. Next slide, please. Our work in historic preservation is one of our most enduring legacies. In the early years of our society, both the New York Society and the National Society were fortunate to have Justine Van Rensselaer Townsend as their visionary leader. Mrs. Townsend was elected to the office of National President in 1894, while continuing in her position as President of the New York Society. Historic preservation was very much a part of her DNA, as she had served as Vice Regent for Mount Vernon from New York and was elected the 3rd Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1891, the same year the NSCDA was formed. It has been said that one of the primary reasons for the incorporation of the New York Society was preserving Van Cortlandt House in the Bronx and opening it to the public. There was a problem with that idea. The house was owned by the city of New York, and the city didn't have the authority to entrust its preservation and restoration to the dames. Undeterred by this legal obstacle, Mrs. Townsend traveled to Albany to lobby the state legislature. Her efforts resulted in the passage of Chapter 837 of the laws of 1896, which authorized the New York City Parks Department to entrust Van Cortlandt House to the New York Dames. These ladies enthusiastically undertook the restoration and maintenance of Van Cortlandt, and on May 27, 1897, the house was opened to the public. As the first state society to take the responsibility for the custody and operation of a museum house, the New York Dames were pioneers. Thus began the Dames' longstanding mission of historic preservation. Next slide, please. The Dames were at the forefront of the preservation movement, and one of the first and most significant projects undertaken by the National Society was the re-erection of the early 17th century church at historic Jamestown in 1906 to commemorate the tercentenary anniversary of the first permanent English settlement in North America. The church was presented to the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, now Preservation Virginia, in 1907. 100 years later, our National Society commemorated the 400th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown and funded the preservation efforts to stabilize the foundations of the church. 3 years ago, the NSCDA renewed its support in providing funds for critical conservation work in the church for the commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the first legislative assembly on North American soil, which was held in 1619 within the footprint of the Jamestown Memorial Church. Next slide, please. Salgrave Manor in England is the longest continually supported museum property by the NSCDA. Although individual corporate societies may have undertaken museum property preservation projects earlier, Salgrave Manor was the first nationally supported historic house. Built in 1539 by Lawrence Washington, fifth great-grandfather of George Washington, it is the oldest property and only overseas museum property supported by the NSCDA. It is currently owned and managed by the Salgrave Manor Trust. In 1914, the NSCDA began its support of Salgrave Manor, and by 1924, our members had raised $112,000 from 35,000 subscribers around the country to endow the manor and grounds in perpetuity. This endowment is an essential source of funding for the annual operation and preservation of Salgrave Manor. Dames also participate in raising funds for special preservation projects. The year 2021 marks the centennial of the opening of the manor to the public. Unfortunately, due to the global pandemic, the centennial celebration has been postponed until May 2022. Next slide, please. In 1928, with the leadership of Honorary President Clorinda Pendleton Lamar, the NSCDA acquired an early federal house in our nation's capital for its national headquarters and museum to worthily illustrate the character and objects of the society. For over 90 years, the NSCDA has stewarded Dunbarton House, the only property it wholly owns, in accord with that purpose. The NSCDA also established a National Archives and Museum collection to bring to life the Society's mission of preservation and year-round history education for the public in historic Georgetown. Dunbarton House is our national symbol that serves our members as an iconic representation of the values and mission of the National Society. It provides examples of the highest standards, including best practices in preservation, education, and collections management, which are available to each of our 44 corporate societies to enable the greatest impact with their programs, properties, collections, and education outreach. Next slide, please. Dunstan Hall is another property supported nationally by the Dames with our time, talent, and treasure. Lewis and Eleanor Doggett Hurdle, the last private owners of Dunstan Hall, deeded the property to the Commonwealth of Virginia with the proviso that the property be administered by a board of regents comprised of members of the NSCDA. Mrs. Hurdle was a member of our society and was very familiar with our work in historic preservation. It was the Hurdles' intent that Dunstan Hall would serve as a perpetual memorial to George Mason in honor of his commitment to just government and civic righteousness. The NSCDA officially assumed its stewardship role in 1949. One of the most significant projects undertaken by the Regents in the past 2 years is the restoration of George Mason's Riverside Garden, which has transformed the landscape of Dunstan Hall's historic core. Now we will talk about our work in the 21st century. Next slide, please. In 2000, the NSCDA received the National Trust Preservation Award, recognizing our continuous and significant role in historic preservation for over 100 years. Today, the NSCDA and our corporate societies own, operate, or provide significant support for over 90 historic sites, museums, and collections across the country and in England. Next slide, please. After preserving and caring for so many places throughout our long history, it seemed only natural that our next step would be to unite these special places in an official way. As we approached our organization's 125th anniversary in 2016, our vision was to create a museum alliance to fully engage a larger and more diverse audience and embody all aspects of the NSCDA mission. Next slide, please. Last May, during the pandemic, our newest initiative, Great American Treasures, was launched to the public. With greatamericantreasures.org, we are reaching a broader new audience who perceive our treasures as a curated collection. This initiative fulfills the Dame's long-held belief that every place has a story to tell. Our historic sites tell America's story through this larger narrative, which now connects these sites in our Museum Alliance. Today, over 60 Dames affiliated properties are members of Great American Treasures. In conjunction with Great American Treasures, an Endowed Museum Alliance grant fund is being established to award competitive grants to the Great American Treasures member sites. Next slide, please. The NSCDA also supports our affiliated museum properties nationally in their collections and interpretive work through a scholarship established in 2013 to support staff participation in the Addingham Summer School in England. This scholarship offers a rare opportunity for our outstanding, highly qualified museum professionals employed by museum properties in the Museum Alliance to be considered to attend the Addingham Summer School. Our museum professionals may apply, and upon acceptance by the school, one individual per year may be awarded the scholarship. Next slide, please. Being entrusted with history's future is a big responsibility, and one the NSCDA doesn't take lightly. Preserving history for future generations has been at the forefront of our work for 130 years. So the creation of Great American Treasures as a national alliance of uniquely American historic places is driven by our legacy of promoting excellence in preservation and sharing this knowledge with others. It unites and promotes our historic properties while paying tribute to our long legacy of preservation work. Today, I have introduced you to a few of our members who have made outstanding contributions to the preservation of historic homes and sites through their leadership in the NSCDA. I could tell more stories about the members of our corporate societies who have guided the preservation efforts for their museum properties. So many of our members who have been at the forefront of preservation have been volunteers and therefore have not received professional recognition. They are the unsung heroines of historic preservation. Thank you for being with us today. I hope you have enjoyed learning more about the NSCDA and our enduring commitment to preservation. Come visit our Great American Treasures. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Lydia Brandt, who will talk about the Mount Vernon Ladies Association.
Thank you, Anna, and good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from Mount Vernon in South Carolina, so we'll see how this goes. If I could have my next slide, please. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association's preservation of George Washington's Mount Vernon is the stuff of legend, and it's a bedtime story most of us know. An invalid South Carolinian, Anne Pamela Cunningham, rallied women from across the nation to save the house from supposed ruin. They formed the first historic preservation organization composed exclusively of women and raised more than $200,000, about $6.5 million in 2021 money, to purchase the home from the Washington family. Next slide, please. They then transformed this former plantation into the first historic house museum in America, setting the stage for an entire industry of tourism and public history for generations. I'd like to take my time today, very brief time, to pull at the threads of this legend, to be a little bit more specific and hopefully surprising about some of the MVLA's achievements in the field of historic preservation. For one, the women of the MVLA used their gender very deftly to make specific arguments for their particular fitness to steward George Washington's memory. The fact that the MVLA still owns and operates Mount Vernon, and that they inspired so many women's preservation organizations in the decades that followed, speaks to the success of their strategy. Next slide, please. George Washington's memory was a ping pong ball in the sectional political debates of the 1850s. Southerners defending slavery used his status as a slaveholder to argue for the righteousness of the institution. Following secession, they even put his image on the seal of the Confederate States of America, which you see on the upper left. Northerners, meanwhile, argued that the deterioration, the physical state of Mount Vernon was evidence of the sad state of the nation, dependent upon an immoral labor system. The ladies argued that because they were women and excluded from the political process, they couldn't vote, that they could keep George Washington's memory and Mount Vernon out of this political fray. Even more importantly, they treated Mount Vernon like a shrine, a holy place entirely out of space and time. They chose to see Mount Vernon as a place of reverence, eschewing its identity as a plantation and taking it out of the highly fraught political moment. They also formed an organization with board members from different states. Next slide, please. Both from the North and the South, to show that Mount Vernon would belong to the entire nation. Mount Vernon's board is still organized this way. Vice regents represent individual states. The MVLA's second contribution I'd like to highlight today is their belief in the power of objects to not only transport people back to the past, but also to inspire them to embrace the values and characteristics of historic figures like George Washington. Next slide, please. Mount Vernon was empty when the MVLA purchased it, and they really had no idea or precedence for how to transform it into what we think of now as a house museum. But these women were incredibly resourceful, and they believed, most importantly and wholeheartedly, in the importance of collecting objects owned and used by the Washingtons, as well as the potential impact of displaying those objects in the spaces that they originally occupied and in believable tableaus that gave a sense of the whole space in which those objects would have originally resided. Next slide, please. The first thing to come back to Mount Vernon after the MVLA bought the property was the harpsichord that Washington gave to his beloved step-granddaughter, Nellie Custis. This was a very important object to the ladies' early interpretation of the house because of its ability to tell stories about the Washington family. Musical instruments are very human pieces of furniture. They require bodies to interact with them in order for them to become activated. They have to be played. This object, placed into Mount Vernon in the 1860s, connected Washington to his beloved step-grandchildren. It allowed the ladies and early tourists to imagine him as a doting grandpa, much more than just the stoic general. In other words, this object helped to make George Washington relatable. Other items were brought from the ladies' own homes or purchased for the house to keep it from looking empty, to round out the scene in visitors' imaginations. Next slide, please. The experience of authentic historic objects is still central to the MVLA's mission today. The harpsichord was recently replicated at Colonial Williamsburg so that the original can be safely preserved in the Museum and Education Center. The copy, meanwhile, can live in the house and, most importantly, can be played, taking that magical kind of imagination to the next level. The third contribution of the MVLA I'd like to talk about today hopefully will be a little bit surprising to you, but it's one on which I've focused a lot of my scholarship and research. By preserving Mount Vernon as it was during George Washington's lifetime, the MVLA created opportunities for Americans to interpret the house for themselves, to decide what it meant for them. Next slide, please. The ladies made it possible for Americans to not only see and visit Mount Vernon in person, but to get to know the house through images, histories, and even films. Mount Vernon recently digitized a fabulous film tour of Mount Vernon from the 1950s that you can access through the link that'll go in the chat in just a second. Check it out. By making Mount Vernon available to generations of Americans, the MVLA offered fodder for people to make their own versions of Mount Vernon. Next slide, please. They made the most out of Mount Vernon's image in advertising everything from liquor to fast food, to transform the house and its iconic portico into funeral homes, motels, and their own suburban dream homes. The MVLA's efforts ensured that not only did Americans get to know Mount Vernon, but they incorporated its history and its architecture into their daily lives. The result is that Mount Vernon is the most copied historic house in America. Mount Vernon is everywhere. I'd love for you to see and contribute to the Mount Vernon Everywhere project that tracks Mount Vernons across the nation, linked in the chat. The infusion of Mount Vernon into the everyday experience of Americans was not expected and definitely not always welcomed by the MVLA. But it did help to popularize public history and gave Americans ownership over Mount Vernon. Next slide, please. I hope I've given you a little sense of what it really means when we say that the MVLA started the historic preservation movement in America. The MVLA made their gender a central part of their argument for their fitness to own and operate Mount Vernon as a means to remove the house and George Washington's memory from politics and to justify its preservation as a national shrine. The ladies believed deeply in material culture's ability to transport us into the past, to listen more closely to its lessons. And their preservation of Mount Vernon made it possible for public history to become truly public, for Americans to take their history into their own hands and play with it, manipulate it to make it their own. These accomplishments are still highly relevant today. While all preservation is inherently political, who is doing the preservation and their particular life perspectives are also central to the interpretations of the historic places that they offer. This is becoming an increasingly visible issue as we discuss what is preserved, how, and the inclusivity of stories that we tell. Material culture continues to be central to the goals of historic preservationists. It's the crux of why we do what we do. The inherent importance of the object and the tangible connections it makes between past and present. And finally, thankfully, now more than ever, Americans are taking ownership of their history. They're asking questions, they're challenging, and they're feeling entitled to understand the history they've learned and will teach to future generations. So thank you. And now I'd like to turn it over to Amy Williams, Chief of Museums Operations for the Andrew Jackson Foundation, one of the organizations inspired by the MVLA.
Thank you, Lydia. As Lydia indicated, the Ladies Hermitage Association did indeed base itself on the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to the effect that basically they did what modern day equivalent of a copy and paste with the MVLA bylaws, and the original bylaws of the LHA are an absolute mirror presentation. The Ladies Association started in 1889 to preserve the home and legacy of Andrew Jackson. It was, as I said, modeled very closely on the MVLA, but to understand the LHA, we need to begin a bit before their formation so that we understand why they felt there was a need. Next slide, please. The LHA came into formation because they felt a distinct need, and that was because the Hermitage was in a state of deterioration and was basically falling apart. Andrew Jackson had died in 1845 and had left everything, to Andrew Jackson Jr., who had the properties across Tennessee as well as other states for about 10 years before he was going broke. He was selling off property. He had not inherited his father's business sense. And by 1856, he sold the remaining 500 acres plus the Hermitage mansion to the state of Tennessee and moved to a plantation in Alabama that his family still owned. By 1860, they had moved back to the Hermitage, having lost the Alabama property. Although state-owned, there appears to be no agreement that the Jacksons could move back in, but they moved back into the home with Andrew Jackson Jr., his wife, and family. When Jr. dies in 1865, the family stays there. There seems to be lore to the effect that the state had agreed that his wife, Sarah, could live out her life there, but there's nothing in writing. So when she passes away in 1887, her oldest son, Andrew Jackson III, and his family are living in the home, but the state starts to eye the property for a possible Confederate veterans' home. And that is indeed where the state was heading. That is when Amy Jackson, who is Andrew Jackson III's wife, decides that a way to possibly save the home, which they are still living in, would be to form a foundation to preserve the home and the legacy of her great father-in-law. And that is exactly what happens. Amy speaks to some of the influential women in Nashville, and the idea catches fire. And in 4 short months, the Andrew Jackson the Ladies Hermitage Association is founded. Next slide, please. Amy Jackson apparently never was involved directly in the LHA, but the idea caught fire. And the ladies were nothing if not tenacious and dogged. They worked the parlors of Nashville, they worked the editorial section of newspapers in Nashville, and they haunted the halls of the state legislature. This quote here you see, give the ladies what they asked for, let them have something to play with. Well, something to play with it was. It was a disaster. It needed all kinds of work. It was a formidable task that the ladies suddenly found themselves with. They had formed with the goal of obtaining 250 of the 500 state-owned acres plus the buildings. What they actually got from the state is this little slip you see in the image, which was only 25 acres plus most of the buildings that were still intact. And that was plenty. The garden was in ruin, the old log enslaved cabins were falling down, and the house was in disrepair. Next slide, please. The ladies got right to work. They also had this sense from the beginning that they shouldn't change that which Jackson had had. Again, I think the MVLA had a lot to do with that. And also they had a firm sense of what they were trying to do from the beginning. With the Jackson family still living in the house, they focused most of their initial projects the first couple of years on the outbuildings, the enslaved cabins that were in disrepair, as well as trying to repair the garden, which Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel, was so very fond of. There was much, much work to be done. And if you read the minutes of the early LHA, you see references to tuck pointing the log cabins, fixing chimneys on the old log cabins, replanting plants. And you also see mention of, we didn't want to touch the wallpaper in the main hallway because we weren't sure what to do. And the hallway paper was put up in 1836, and we are very proud to say it is still in the hallway today. We are very grateful that the ladies, just not being sure what to do, just didn't do. There are also notes in the minutes about getting a hold of cases to put things into to preserve them, because they'd opened the lower level of the house immediately to tours. So there are references to putting netting over fireplace mantles so people don't chip pieces off as mementos. But again, the Jacksons are still living upstairs, and there are negotiations going back and forth throughout this whole time. 4 years after the ladies got ownership of the property, Andrew Jackson III and his family move out. And as the ladies said in one of their memoirs, is they took everything but the boot scraper. So if you can imagine, they had owned and operated a fully furnished home for 4 complete years before Jackson moves out, taking everything, and suddenly they have an empty shell. But what that empty shell gave them the opportunity to do was to fix it up, because most of the projects prior to this were outside the house and with other outbuildings. And suddenly a flurry of work begins on the mansion itself. We see painting going on, replaster work, laying of new carpets. But as with most nonprofit organizations, next slide, please, the constant money woes. The LHA started as the MVLA did, with state regents, vice regents across the country, but that didn't really catch on the same way it did with the MVLA. And we see a refocusing on Nashville and Tennessee participation in particular. And there was no money, and there was everything to do and no money to do it with. The ladies hosted concerts, they put on plays, they had excursions out to the Hermitage, which it was still very difficult to get from Nashville out to the Hermitage in the early days. But these were all efforts they went through to try to raise money, to try to fix up the property and return it to its former glory. They were all very preservation minded. They consulted with people. They had a male board of regents that the state had required to oversee the ladies' work and efforts. And there's a mention about 4 years in, when they had that board of regents meet at the Hermitage, that the men were most impressed with the abilities of the ladies to restore the property. Next slide, please. Today, there is no small duty upon us. One of the parting messages of the original secretary of the LHA was to see to it no modern enterprise breaks in upon the hallowed spot and changes it. Let no vandal hand desecrate it in the name of progress or commercialism. It is our trust and our duty. And we feel that very strongly at the Andrew Jackson Hermitage. We changed the name in 2014. It was a very difficult decision, but we changed it from the Ladies Hermitage Association to the Andrew Jackson Foundation, but it no way changed our mission nor our focus. And we continue with those preservation efforts today. One of the most impressive things about the Ladies Hermitage Association is they had an empty home 4 years after they had acquired it, and yet they spent the next 100 years buying back or having donated back the items that had been in that home when they first acquired it. They have also spent decades purchasing back the original property of the Andrew Jackson Hermitage plantation. And today the LHA operates 1,120 acres, and the home is one of the most authentically furnished homes in America. They're about 95% of everything in the home dates to Jackson and was his personal property. So these tenacious ladies started out strong with the 46th General Assembly of the state of Tennessee running when they heard they were in the hallways asking for the property, through decades of dedicated work, lots of hard times, but their focus was always on stabilizing the home, preserving the home, and preserving the legacy of our 7th president. Last slide, please. So in closing, this image is of our founding ladies. This is one of the earliest photographs of the ladies out at the tomb of the Andrew Jackson and his wife, Rachel. Tenacious ladies following in the footsteps of the MVLA to preserve the seventh home of, the seventh president of the United States. So I thank you very much, and I will turn it over now. I'm sorry, where'd you go? I lost to Maddie Nelson. Maddie? Elizabeth, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Amy. I'm Elizabeth Castelni, and good morning. Thanks to the NSCDA and the Smithsonian for organizing this exciting program. I'm certain there is something we all share, a moment when we knew historic places mattered. For me, it came when I stood with my grandmother on the banks of the James River. She inspired my love of history and my imagination of what could be discovered. Little did either of us imagine decades later, I would lead the organization that has protected Jamestown for more than 128 years. The Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities was born out of the tenacious and dedicated vision of women. Founded by Mary Jeffrey Galt and Cynthia Beverly Tucker Coleman, Preservation Virginia, as it is known today, has a long and shared history with the NSCDA and the other organizations represented on this panel. Embedded in our collective mission is the strong and unflinching belief that the physical places and objects of historic memory should be preserved as a way to share stories of the people, places, and events of American history. While the narrative of that history was tightly defined and narrowly focused in the early years, our work has expanded over time to ensure the diversity of American history and historic places are preserved and told. As the nation's first private statewide preservation organization, Preservation Virginia saved Williamsburg's powder magazine 36 years before Colonial Williamsburg was organized. In the early years and one building at a time, the founders saved historic places across Virginia. Next slide. In total, Preservation Virginia's efforts have saved more than 500 of Virginia's historic places in 132 years, including historic Jamestown, Patrick Henry's Scotchtown, John Marshall's Richmond Home, Cape Henry Lighthouse, and in Surrey, Bacon's Castle and Smith's Fort, all of which we continue to operate today. Today, we embrace historic places as centers for learning and education. Buildings, downtowns, and rural districts are catalysts that stimulate our economy by repurposing old buildings and through heritage tourism. They offer forums where our communities confront and discuss the complexities of past events and find understanding and empathy. To illustrate women's continual impact, I'd like to share a few examples from our past and our present work. Let's start at Jamestown. Next slide. Our founders acquired 22.5 acres in 1893. Within the first decade, the ladies opened the site to the public, launched an archaeological investigation, and lobbied Congress to provide funding to build a seawall to protect from further erosion. With the help of the NSCDA, as was previously mentioned, a memorial church was constructed to protect the archaeological foundations of the 17th century churches. Next slide. 125 years later, Mariana Hartley, senior archaeologist, conducted an investigation within the reconstructed church to uncover and study the place where the first legislative assembly in North America met in 1619. Guided by the 1902 notes of amateur archaeologists Mary Jeffrey Galt, Mary Winder Garrett, and Annie Galt, Ms. Hartley led the archaeological team in carefully peeling back 5 inches of cement and 3 inches of brick to find the evidence of the wooden 1617 church. One evening, the team stood back in realization that they were looking at the cobblestone footings that literally and figuratively represent the foundations of our American democracy. The place where, beginning on July 30th, 1619, Governor Sir George Yardley, his 4 counselors, and 22 burgesses met, planting the seeds of American democracy. Next slide. From our beginnings, Preservation Virginia pioneered the statewide preservation movement. Local advocates were voices for the intrinsic value of the urban and rural resources. Beginning in the 1970s, Shirley Van Landingham championed preservation as a community value. She pushed for impactful statewide policies like historic easements and the Main Street program, and programs including the annual list of Virginia's most endangered historic places. From those listings, Preservation Virginia engages community advocates to raise awareness of solutions that preserve these resources and allow for growth and adaptation. Recent listings included protecting the integrity of the James River's indigenous cultural landscape, Virginia's Rosenwald schools, Rossawick, the historic capital of the Monacan Nation, and Shockoe Bottom. Next slide. Throughout the 19th century, Shockoe Bottom bustled with activity from 69 auction houses and related businesses that served Richmond's slave trading operations that was second only to New Orleans. By the mid-20th century, that history was literally entombed in asphalt. By a 2014 listing on Virginia's and America's 11 most endangered lists sounded an alarm to a baseball stadium proposal that would destroy the site. Preservation Virginia and the National Trust for Historic Preservation joined with Anna Edwards, founder of the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, a social and racial justice organization, to defeat the baseball stadium proposal. We continue to support Ms. Edwards and her work to engage the descendant community in a process to envision a memorial park where the history of the African burial ground and Shockoe's urban landscape could be acknowledged and commemorated. Today, the city of Richmond is overseeing a small area planning process to not only create and fund a park and the museum, but also to ensure equity in the development of the surrounding area to benefit the people most disenfranchised by Shockoe's history and support access to housing, training, and opportunities of generational wealth building. Next slide. In 1907, Chief Justice John Marshall's granddaughter sold his home to the city of Richmond. Given its condition and location, the city's first plan was to tear it down and build a high school in Marshall's honor. Enter Preservation Virginia and the women of Richmond and Virginia. After successful negotiations with the city, Preservation Virginia opened the house in 1911 as a museum honoring Marshall's life. Descendants, including Miss Ellen Smith and later her niece, Mary Douthit Higgins, pictured here, nudged and cajoled their family members to return furnishings, decorative arts, and other items that had been Marshall's, including the judicial robe worn during his 34-year influential and policy-defining tenure as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Next slide, please. Over the past year, Jennifer Hurst-Winder, Director of Museum Operations, and Leah Lane, our Curator of Collections, have diligently worked with the conservator Howard Sutcliffe to stabilize the silk that deteriorated as a result of the iron-based dye used in its manufacture and years of dust, sweat, and wear from the Chief Justice's use, and more years of display. Next week, the Marshall robe will return to his Richmond home and be displayed in a specially designed case to help slow future deterioration. Next slide. Throughout our 132-year history, the women of Preservation Virginia have fought to save and preserve the remarkable and distinctive structures, buildings, landscapes, and collections that tell a complete and expansive story of Virginia history. I close with the words of J. Alston Cabell at the dedication of the memorial gates presented by the Colonial Danes in 1907 at Jamestown. In part, he said, "Any work that requires sincere, unselfish devotion is best entrusted to the love and sympathy of women." Thank you, and I'll return the screen back to Michelle.
Thank you so much, all of the presenters this morning, for sharing their insights, and especially for the history of women in preservation. This morning has been an opportunity to learn more about professional training, experiences, leadership, and to consider just how women of preservation have impacted the field. And I wondered, first of all, I have a few questions for all of you, but are there any questions you have for each other listening to the panel today? Okay, you don't have to, because there are already questions in the chat. And a question from me is about our difficult year that we've been going through. With the difficult year and changes ahead, is there anything you'd like to share for the hope for the future of preservation and using lessons learned from the professional women of the past to inform our present?
I'm happy
Elizabeth?
to start.
Sure.
One of the first things we did when the pandemic began last year was to search our records to see if there was any mention of the influenza in the 19-teens, 20s. And we were startled, there really wasn't. So one of the goals we've had is to build a record for future generations. Hopefully they won't have another pandemic. But also to look at just the discussions around racial justice, to document that as part of our history and how we've approached it. So it'll be there as a record.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I want to jump to the Q&A because we do have questions coming in. First one is, all of these organizations have done remarkable work to preserve our country's history. Were there other organizations that you know about from other countries that were doing similar work at the time or prior to these organizations?
So I can speak to that one. I looked really hard because as a scholar, I'm always looking to disrupt the leading narratives, the standard stories that we tell ourselves. And it seems that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association really did not have any precedents in America. They were truly pioneers in that way. That said, they were picking up on, and I could never really figure out how informed they were on these discussions, but on discussions that were happening in France and particularly England on different approaches to historic preservation, really the foundations of historic preservation theory. They were clearly thinking of the same ideas. Whether or not they were reading and engaged with those conversations directly was something I was not able to determine. But it was satisfying to find that they truly were pioneers and inventing it as they went along. And their struggles and conversations about how difficult it was and the questions and challenges that they were asking and facing are testament to just how hard that was. I learned very recently that I'm always learning more organizations that were influenced by them. And recently I was talking to a friend of mine who works for the National Park Service, and she was telling me that the organization that began and was really started by Frederick Douglass's wife to preserve Frederick Douglass's house as a house museum in 1900 was founded on the same model as the MVLA. So it's always interesting to see more organizations that came after the MVLA that were based on that same format, even if they changed as the Andrew Jackson Foundation did.
Thank you, Lydia. So everyone's commenting about the remarkable work that you all presented this morning. Do you have any favorite stories about your various organizations that you didn't include in your talks today?
I think there are so many things that we are working on today, and we realize how the stories have changed over time, and we're always looking for new ways of interpreting the history. But there are a couple of projects that I would like to highlight, and you'll hear more about them, I think, as we move through the sessions today. But one is at Stenton, who is in Philadelphia, and they have the Dinah Memorial Project. And Dinah was an enslaved woman who literally saved Stenton during, with the British. I mean, James Logan had entrusted her with his property when he was not there. And they have memorialized her, and they're continuing to talk about her story. Also, the Neil Cochran House, and you'll hear more from Rowena Dash and their work with the University of Texas at Austin about If These Walls Could Talk, and really interpreting and talking about the whole slavery issue and looking to interpret the dependency and to really tell a fuller story. And I think that's the most important thing, that we tell the whole story. And I think that has really become more and more evident in the past decade, if not the past year.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Amy.
Oh, the LHA, of course, is a little over 130 years old, and there's so many wonderful stories to tell. And when we have visitors to the property and I talk with them, I like to say that, the mission is to preserve the home and property of Andrew Jackson and his life and legacy. But the stories we have available on this property to share and need to share, it's our obligation to share, are so deep and varied. It's one of the things that attracted me to the property to begin with, to come work here. And the Ladies Hermitage Association, the minutes are just wonderful. They'll discuss planning a big outing from Nashville out to the Hermitage for the day to work in the gardens themselves. And then the next note will say, Mrs. Baxter and I arrived, having not found any other members ready to leave on our excursion. So you see, it's kind of like committee work today. Yeah, there are always a couple that are doing the bulk of the work and some that might not be. But their preservation, they were really focused. When the house was empty, they may have purchased a few items to fill it for a while, but they didn't undo anything that they knew had to be preserved. And today we have 6 rooms in the house with original wallpaper from 1836 because the ladies were careful and didn't undo anything that they knew was original to the home. And it's just very impressive because, as Lydia said, there wasn't really a guidebook for what to do with these places at that time. So it's interesting to see the decisions they made.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, next question. This has been a hard time for many organizations with the pandemic. And I'm sure that all of you have experienced this with limited in-person events. Has this virtual time allowed you to adapt and reach more people? Or have you found some silver lining through this trying time?
I think that absolutely we have been able to engage a larger audience. I mean, we were faced with a biennial meeting, which is when we change our officers every 2 years. And we made the decision to go virtual. And we had at least 3 or 4 times the numbers. And we could expand our programming and had some amazing speakers where we would normally have, 3 or 4 workshops. We expanded to 15 workshops that week. But when we went virtual, it's just been amazing to see what's happened. I think the lesson too is just looking at our members from the past and all these women who are just so remarkable, when they didn't even have the right to vote and they were lobbying legislatures to take over, homes and really preserve the history. But it's just perseverance and just to keep moving forward. And that to me has been the great lesson that we learned. We had not really had a lot of virtual programs, but we pivoted to that, and it's really made quite a difference in our outreach to members and to the community as a whole.
It was wonderful to watch the numbers going up of people watching us today. So thank you all out there. Go ahead, Amy.
I was going to say, in addition to the virtual programming, we also discovered And I think it's a result not just of the pandemic, but of the social changes that the country's experienced in over the past year. Our numbers, when we reopened to the public last summer, obviously the numbers were far down, but who was coming had changed dramatically. We found it very, very interesting. Our guests became much younger and much, much more diverse. And the wonderful opportunity that came from the pandemic, if you will, is because of those lower numbers, we were able to engage so much more intensely with our guests. And because of where the country was last year, they wanted that more intense engagement. So we had some wonderful, wonderful learning opportunities and discourse with our guests last year.
Terrific. Thank you, Amy. Very good question in the Q&A. How did women of color, especially enslaved women, support or enable the preservation of the historic sites or their furnishings that we've considered today, such as Mount Vernon, the Hermitage, or Preservation Virginia property?
I can speak to that a little bit. The enslaved women and also enslaved men that were owned by the Washington family were obviously integral to preserving the material culture of the house and the plantation during the Washington's ownership. But they also were really key to telling the stories of Mount Vernon. And there's been some fascinating work done by a friend of mine, Scott Casper, who wrote a book called Sarah Johnson's Mount Vernon that I really highly recommend, about Mount Vernon in the 19th century, that tracks these relationships between enslaved people and people coming to visit Mount Vernon, even before it was owned by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And when the MVLA purchased the property in 1858, they decided as a group that they were not going to own slaves, that was not going to be part of their work. But they did employ formerly enslaved people after emancipation in order to take those stories that were integrally tied to the history of the place into account as they were wallpapering rooms and as they were starting to shape the interpretation of the mansion. And so there's some fascinating work that Scott's done tracing the ways in which African-American stories about life on the plantation, not just about the Washingtons, was central to those early years of interpretation.
And I would use Bacon's Castle as an example. It's a 1665 house, oldest brick house in North America, located in Surrey County. And one of the great things that has happened there is that the descendant community has come back to the house, both those members of the enslaved households and also families of the sharecroppers that farmed the land. They actually have their reunions. They are part of our annual family gatherings at Bacon's Castle, and they brought their rich stories to our interpretation. So we learn more each year as new stories come back to the site.
The Hermitage also has traced some descendants. It's something that unfortunately the LHA was not focused on early in its inception. However, there was an enslaved gentleman who was born enslaved on the property who never left after emancipation. He remained as a free man on the property throughout his life, and he actually was the first tour guide for the Ladies Hermitage Association of the Hermitage. And he owned items that he had purchased from Andrew Jackson III to put in his cabin that he lived in. And the LHA actually purchased those items back eventually. And one of the agreements they had with him was that when he passed, he wanted his funeral in the main hallway of the mansion house, and he wanted to be buried next to the tomb of the Jacksons. And the ladies actually followed through on that commitment. When he died, we have photographs of his funeral in the main hallway of the mansion, and his grave is next to the tomb. So it's a interesting story, a testimony, I think, both to his character and the lady's character, that they had this kind of odd relationship with Alfred.
Thank you. Amy. I just want to say we have a bunch of questions. If we run out of time, I'm hoping that all of you who are watching will contact our panelists through email and follow up if we don't get to your question online here today. But the next question, as Elizabeth beautifully put it, we all have had that moment when we realize the importance of history and preservation. Can any of you remember what first drew you to this work? Who wants to take it first? Elizabeth?
Well, it was that moment standing on the banks of the James River. My grandmother said to me, "Isn't it a shame that Jamestown is lost to this river?" And Jamestown was always a special place that I returned to. And then lo and behold, I became part of the organization as the curator when we launched the Jamestown Rediscovery Project with Dr. William Kelso to find the archaeological remains of 1607 Jamesport. And it was one of those few times my grandmother was wrong, because the fort is still on the land and was not destroyed by the river.
My relationship with historic preservation, I always was interested in history, but came with a much later historic site, the downtown mall in Charlottesville, Virginia. I went to UVA, and I am a Charlottesville native. I'm a townie gownie. And in the early 2000s, the city council was going to rip up all the bricks on the mall. And I was really upset by this, but didn't know how or why. And so started doing research and advocating with some of my my faculty at UVA and my fellow classmates, and learned a tremendous amount about Lawrence Halprin's really important design for the downtown mall in Charlottesville. And we advocated first for the saving of the 365,000 bricks that form the base of the downtown mall, but we lost that fight. But we made many other wins in the process, and that was really what tied me, not just to historic preservation, but the advocacy part of it, that sense of discovery as you try to get other people to believe you and run with you in trying to save a place. You realize you have to know a lot about it. You have to learn a lot about it in order to really sell that advocacy. So that's when I fell in love with it.
I think my love started when I was a teenager in Thomasville, Georgia. And a wonderful lady had come back to Thomasville and had started Thomasville Landmarks. And she also at that point, decided that she would like for us to start a junior landmarks. And so as a high school freshman, I became the president of Thomasville Junior Landmarks. And I have had a passion for historic preservation since that time.
I don't know if I had a particular moment. When I was very young, my parents took us to Europe for several different trips, and I remember what Lydia said in her presentation about that ability to touch and feel history, and walking through castles as a very 6-7-year-old child, and it was that connection, and I think that's what the point is for preservation of all of these places, is to make that connection, to actually walk the halls, to touch and feel the things. And it's that connection, that relatability. And I think I just kind of felt that at a very young age. So not a particular moment, just a thing since I was a very small child.
Thanks, Amy. And this next question is specifically for you. No mention of inclusivity or how moving forward with embracing the slave ownership or Trail of Tears of Andrew Jackson's story. How are you or the group that you work for actively working to embrace and educate this side of his legacy? Thanks.
Sure. As a public offering, we do have a tour that is dedicated to the lives of the enslaved at the Hermitage. It's about an hour-and-a-half experience for any guests who want to partake of it. It's offered daily. It's primarily outside and focuses on the lives of the slaves that we actually know the names and the occupations of and have records of, so that we can talk about them. Again, it's that connectivity to bring them down to individual human beings and their roles at the Hermitage. We also teach about the enslaved community. We also teach Indian removal in all of our education. We have a wagon ride that will go out to the slave quarters out in the fields so people can see the archaeology that has been done out there in the fields to preserve the foundation remains of the enslaved quarters out in the field. I mentioned earlier the LHA did not come quickly to embracing that story. We are a Southern site, so it is not something that was embraced early on. The focus was for the first many decades on Andrew Jackson and his family specifically. But starting in the 80s, you saw the LHA turn more and more to telling the stories of everyone that lived on this property. And especially in the last 15 years, there's been an acceleration on that emphasis. We still have work to do on the Trail of Tears and the relationship with Andrew Jackson to Native communities. As I said, we do teach Indian removal in all of our education programs. And it certainly is represented in our tours with guests, as well as in our permanent exhibit in the visitor center. But we do have a way to go with that part of the story, absolutely.
Okay, we're going to talk later about that. I would love to talk more about that, and especially in my work now at the National Museum of American Indian. So thank you, Amy, for all the work that you're doing there. All right, we have a lot of questions. This is going really well with the Q&A of our interested participants. So next is, as Ms. Brandt noted, late 19th century women often argued that they were most fit to preserve American history because they were outside of the political fray. Can you talk a little bit about how this ties into the idea of Republican motherhood? And then how did that argument change as more women across America did start voting, running for, and holding office in the early 20th century?
Great question. And it was absolutely tied to the arguments around Republican motherhood. This idea that women as disenfranchised disenfranchised Americans, they had a special role to play in rearing and preparing future citizens, especially future male citizens. And so creating a viable, believable space in which George Washington was a full man, was a husband, was a grandfather, was really important to their presentation of American patriotism. And they saw Mount Vernon as a tool to make better and more patriotic Americans. And I think that's still part of the mission. I mean, I think that's still part of the idea, even if most of the work now and since the 1930s has really been done by professionals, not the vice regents. That does not to suggest that they aren't still intimately involved with decisions on every aspect of the interpretation and material culture of Mount Vernon. But that has been turned over in a lot of ways to professionals as more professionals have become part of the historic preservation movement, as that's become just a fact, the professionalization of the curators and the architects and the architectural historians that work on these properties. So I think some of that idea of women being particularly suited to care for Mount Vernon has fallen back, even if the overall goal or mission of creating a space in which we can imagine George Washington has maintained. But they still own it, and they're still the board, and they're still absolutely in charge. And their authority as women is something that they worked really hard to ensure people believed at the end of the 19th century. They were very concerned with establishing that authority at the same time that they were arguing that they were uniquely fitted as women. They were also very aware that they would be uniquely criticized as women for taking on something as momentous and nationally significant as Mount Vernon. So that's something that they've been very careful about over the past 150 years. But obviously they've been successful because their authority has really not been questioned for decades and decades.
Well, we are coming to a close, and I want to thank you all so much for participating today. Your work, your properties, your stories have just been so wonderful. I want to give just a last few seconds to any thoughts on how women entering the field today and our future leaders should consider their work and how you think they can best be suited, best trained to be our leaders for the future. Any final words? Anna, any final words?
Not really. I just think that it is such an incredible field and it's such an important one. Preserving history, if we don't care, from whence we've come, we don't really care where we're going. So all of our work has just been incredible, and it's been such a great beginning to this Women in Preservation Symposium.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Anna, Lydia, Elizabeth, and Amy. It's just the beginning of a great 3 days, and thank you all for watching. We hope you continue to watch the full 3 days.